Welcome back to our channel, where incredible stories unfold. I have an amazing tale that will captivate your imagination from beginning to end. Smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest stories. Thank you. Now let us begin.
He had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most: someone who would love him when he had nothing at all. Marcus Chen adjusted the collar of his deliberately worn flannel shirt, the fabric rough against skin accustomed to Egyptian cotton. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city sprawled below like a glittering circuit board, each light representing dreams he'd already achieved and money he'd already made. At 32, he was worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, yet he felt poorer than the homeless man he'd passed on the street corner. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, everything had changed. Vanessa, beautiful, charming Vanessa, had been the final straw. He'd caught her photographing his bedroom, not out of romantic sentiment, but to show her friends the designer furniture and artwork. When he'd confronted her, she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Come on, Marcus, you didn't think I was with you for your personality, did you?" The memory still burned like acid in his chest. Now, standing in his custom-tailored poverty costume, Marcus studied his reflection in the darkened window. The expensive watch was gone, replaced with a $15 digital one from a convenience store. His usual handcrafted Italian leather shoes had been swapped for scuffed sneakers that pinched his feet. Even his posture had changed. Shoulders slightly slouched, head ducked in the universal language of financial struggle. What do you think drives someone to such desperate measures to find love? Share your thoughts below. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop, displaying a text from his assistant. Tomorrow's board meeting moved to 2 p.m. Also, the Ferrari is ready for pickup. He silenced it, then walked to his walk-in closet, a space larger than most studio apartments, and pulled out a battered backpack he'd bought specifically for this charade. The plan was simple, born from months of sleepless nights and a heart that had been commodified one too many times. He would rent a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, get a job that paid just enough to survive, and meet women the way normal people did, in coffee shops, at bus stops, and grocery stores. No mention of Chen Industries, no black cars, no restaurants where the wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. Just Marcus. Not Marcus Chen CEO, not Marcus Chen heir to a tech empire, just Marcus. The downtown bus exhaled diesel fumes as it wheezed to a stop, its doors opening with a mechanical sigh. Marcus climbed aboard, dropping exact change into the fare box with hands that usually signed $1 million contracts. The plastic seat was sticky beneath his thighs, and the air conditioning wheezed fitfully against the summer heat. Around him, real people lived real lives. A mother bouncing a crying baby, an elderly man reading a newspaper with careful attention, teenagers laughing over shared earbuds. This was the world he'd forgotten existed. His new apartment was a studio in Riverside Heights, a neighborhood that straddled the line between gentrification and grit. The building super, a heavy-set man named Jerry with paint permanently embedded under his fingernails, showed him around with the enthusiasm of someone who'd given this tour 1,000 times. Hot water's reliable most days. Laundromat's in the basement, but the dryer on the left doesn't work. Stick to the right too. Rent's due by the 3rd, or Mrs. Kowalski from 4B will start leaving passive-aggressive notes. The studio was a study in efficient minimalism, though not by choice. A Murphy bed dominated one wall, flanked by a kitchenette that looked like it had been installed during the Reagan administration. The single window faced an alley where cats conducted their mysterious nocturnal business, and the hardwood floors bore the scars of decades of tenants who'd cared just enough to avoid losing their security deposits. "It's perfect," Marcus said, meaning it in ways Jerry couldn't understand. That evening, as he sat on the donated couch he'd bought from a thrift store, the irony of a millionaire haggling over a $20 sofa hadn't been lost on him. He opened a beer, not the craft brewery selections from his wine cellar, but a six-pack of whatever had been cheapest at the corner market. The bitter liquid tasted like liberation. His reflection stared back from the darkened window, and for the first time in months, Marcus smiled. Tomorrow, he would walk into the world as someone entirely different. He would apply for a job at Henderson's Hardware, a family-owned store where the owner, according to his research, valued character over credentials. He would shop for groceries with coupons, take the bus to work, and worry about things like late fees and whether he could afford to eat out twice in the same week. Most importantly, he would meet someone who could love a man with calloused hands and a worried bank balance, someone whose eyes would light up for him and not his portfolio. The city hummed beyond his window, full of possibilities that money had never been able to buy. Somewhere out there was a woman who would prove that authentic love still existed, that hearts could recognize hearts across the artificial barriers of social class. Marcus Chen, millionaire, was about to discover what Marcus, the man, was truly worth.
The morning alarm felt different when it meant something. Marcus. He was training himself to think just Marcus, no last name, no inherited legacy, rolled out of the Murphy bed as sunlight struggled through the grimy window. His back ached in ways his orthopedic mattress had never allowed, but the discomfort felt honest, earned. Henderson's Hardware occupied a corner lot that time had forgotten to modernize. The red brick facade wore its age like a badge of honor, and hand-painted signs advertised everything from keys cut while you wait to we fix what your husband fixed. A bell chimed as Marcus pushed through the glass door, breathing in the intoxicating scent of sawdust, metal polish, and possibility. "Help you with something?" The voice belonged to a man in his 60s, wearing a green apron that had seen more projects than most contractors. His handshake was firm, calloused, real. "I'm here about the job posting," Marcus said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd asked for work instead of offering it? George Henderson looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired and fired more people than he cared to count. "You know anything about hardware?" "I'm a fast learner," which was true enough. You didn't build a tech empire without the ability to absorb information quickly. "Can you lift 50 pounds? Deal with difficult customers? Show up on time even when you don't feel like it?" "Yes, sir." Something in George's weathered face softened. "Minimum wage to start. 30 hours a week, maybe more during busy season. Benefits kick in after 90 days, if you last that long." Marcus had spent more on a single lunch than this job would pay in a week, but he nodded as if George had just offered him the world. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. Don't be late." The rest of the day passed in a blur of inventory systems, price codes, and the geography of nuts, bolts, and widgets. Marcus's hands, soft from years of boardroom meetings, began to show the honest wear of real work. By closing time, his shoulders ached and his feet throbbed, but something inside him felt more solid than it had in years. That's when he saw her. Sarah Martinez was arguing with the self-checkout machine at Murphy's Market, her dark hair escaping from a ponytail that had given up the fight somewhere around hour 10 of what looked like a very long day. She wore scrubs,
the kind that suggested 12-hour shifts and patients who needed more than she could give, and her sneakers had the worn-down heels of someone who spent more time on her feet than off them. "Come on," she muttered to the machine, scanning a can of soup for the third time. "It's tomato soup, not liquid gold." The machine beeped disapprovingly, flashing an error message that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. "Having trouble?" She looked up and he felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were brown. Not just brown, but the deep amber brown of honey and sunlight. Tired but kind. Suspicious but hopeful. "This thing has it out for me," she said, gesturing helplessly at the rebellious technology. "I swear it waits until I'm running late to have an existential crisis." Marcus couldn't help but smile. In his real life, he owned companies that made these machines work. The irony was delicious. "Mind if I try?" She stepped aside and he caught a whiff of her scent. Not expensive perfume, but something clean and honest. Maybe lavender from a drugstore shampoo. His fingers moved over the screen with practiced ease, canceling the error message and resuming the scan. "You're either very lucky or you've got some kind of superpower," Sarah said, as the machine finally, grudgingly, accepted her items. "Just experience with stubborn technology," Marcus replied. "I'm Marcus, by the way." "Sarah." Her smile transformed her face from tired pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Thanks for the rescue. These things usually take one look at me and decide to malfunction." What's the most unexpected place you've met someone special? Tell us in the comments. They walked toward the exit together, Sarah juggling her bags and what looked like a pharmacy's worth of coupons. Marcus noticed she'd bought the generic versions of everything. Store-brand soup, off-brand pasta, discount bread that would be stale by Thursday. "Long day?" he asked, pushing open the door for her. "Every day is a long day when you're a nurse," she said, then caught herself. "Sorry, I don't mean to complain. I love what I do, it's just—" She shrugged, a gesture that encompassed exhaustion, dedication, and the particular burden of caring for others when you barely had time to care for yourself. "You don't have to apologize for being tired," Marcus said gently. "Taking care of people is hard work." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully, as if she was seeing him for the first time. Not his clothes, already wrinkled from his first day at the hardware store, or his scuffed shoes, or the fact that he was clearly counting change for bus fare. She was looking at him. "Are you new around here?" Sarah asked. "I don't think I've seen you before." "Just moved in," Marcus said, which was technically true. "Still figuring everything out." "Well," Sarah said, hefting her bags, "welcome to the neighborhood. It's not much, but the people are good." She started toward the bus stop, then turned back. "Hey, Marcus, thanks again for the machine rescue. Maybe I'll see you around." As her bus pulled away, Marcus stood on the sidewalk feeling like he'd just witnessed magic. For the first time in his adult life, a woman had looked at him, really looked, and seen something worth a second glance that had nothing to do with his bank account. The feeling was intoxicating.
3 weeks into his double life, Marcus had developed calluses on his palms and a strange pride in his growing competence with pipe fittings. Henderson's Hardware had become a refuge he hadn't expected, a place where problems had concrete solutions and success was measured in satisfied customers rather than stock prices. "Marcus, you got a customer asking about those fancy European door handles," George called from behind the register. "Aisle 7. He found Sarah there, studying a display of hardware with the same concentration she probably gave to patient charts. Today she wasn't in scrubs, but wore jeans and a soft green sweater that brought out the amber in her eyes. Her hair was down, and Marcus had to remind himself to breathe. "Well, if it isn't the checkout machine whisperer," she said, her face lighting up with recognition. "Do you work here?" "Guilty as charged," Marcus replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "What can I help you with?" "I'm trying to upgrade the cabinet hardware in my apartment. The landlord said I could make improvements as long as they're an actual improvement."
She held up a tarnished drawer pull. "This is what I'm working with." Marcus examined the hardware with newfound expertise. "These are pretty standard replacements. Are you looking for something specific? Something that doesn't look like it survived the Carter administration?" She laughed, then caught herself. "Sorry, I don't mean to be picky. I spend so much time at work dealing with things that are broken or falling apart. It would be nice to come home to something that actually works properly." There was something in her voice, a weariness that went deeper than long shifts. Marcus found himself wanting to fix more than just her cabinet hardware. "Tell you what, I get off in an hour. If you want, I could come take a look, help you figure out exactly what you need. No charge for the consultation." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "That's really nice of you, but you don't have to." "I want to," Marcus said, and realized he meant it completely. "Besides, I'm still new to the neighborhood. I could use a friend." Her smile was worth more than his last quarterly dividend. "Okay, but I'm making dinner to say thank you. I hope you like pasta with whatever vegetables didn't go bad this week." An hour later, Marcus stood outside Sarah's apartment building, a modest, 3-story walk-up with window boxes that someone had tried to keep alive despite the urban environment. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, and she met him at the door with flour in her hair and an apology. "Fair warning, my place is about the size of a closet and I'm not the world's best cook." If this was what she called a closet, Marcus thought, what would she call his penthouse? A small country? Her studio was maybe 400 square feet, but she'd made it warm and welcoming, with secondhand furniture, plants that somehow thrived despite the limited light, and photographs that told the story of a life lived in service to others, graduation from nursing school, volunteering at a community clinic, laughing with elderly patients. "It's perfect," Marcus said, meaning it in a way that surprised him. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "You don't have to be polite. I know it's not much." "No, really, it feels like home." Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that had nothing to do with square footage or thread count. Sarah looked away first, busying herself with the cabinet doors that hung slightly askew. "So, Dr. Hardware, what's the diagnosis?" Marcus examined the cabinets with careful attention he usually reserved for merger documents. The hardware was indeed ancient, but the real problem was that the doors had been installed slightly off-level, causing them to sag over time. "Good news and bad news," he said. "The good news is new hardware will definitely help. The bad news is the doors need to be adjusted too, or you'll have the same problem in 6 months." "How much is that going to cost?" Sarah asked, and Marcus heard the careful calculation in her voice, the mathematics of necessity versus desire that he'd forgotten existed. "For the hardware? Maybe $40 if we go with something nice, but not fancy. For the adjustment—" He paused, watching her face. "I could do that part. I mean, if you trust me not to destroy your kitchen." "Marcus, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He caught her hands, stopping her protest. Her skin was soft but marked with small cuts and calluses of someone who worked with her hands. "When's the last time someone did something nice for you just because?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. "It's been a while," she admitted softly. "Have you ever met someone who changed your perspective on what really matters? We'd love to hear your story." They spent the evening measuring, planning, and talking in the easy way of people discovering they fit together. Sarah made pasta with vegetables that were indeed on the verge of expiration, but she seasoned them with herbs she grew on her windowsill, and the simple meal tasted better than anything Marcus had eaten in his favorite Michelin-starred restaurants. "So what brought you to Riverside Heights?" Sarah asked, curled up on her second-hand couch with a mug of tea. Marcus felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. "Just needed a change. Sometimes you have to start over to figure out who you really are." "I get that. I moved here after nursing school. My family thought I was crazy, a small-town girl coming to the big city to work in a public hospital for half what I could make in private practice." "Why did you?" Because that's where people actually need help, she shrugged, as if dedicating your life to serving others was the most natural thing in the world. My abuela always said that money can't buy you a clean conscience. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a woman who chose poverty over profit, service over security, and she spoke about it like it was obvious. Meanwhile, I was living an elaborate lie, pretending to be something I wasn't to test her authenticity when she was the most genuine person I'd ever met. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," I managed. She was. She raised me after my parents died. She cleaned offices downtown for 30 years, never missed a day. She used to say the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they do with whatever they've been given. Marcus stared into his tea, afraid Sarah would see the guilt written across his face. What had I done with what I'd been given? Built an empire, certainly, created jobs, made smart investments, donated to charities whose names looked good on tax forms. But when was the last time I'd actually helped someone the way Sarah helped people every day? "You okay?" Sarah asked gently. "You look like you're carrying the world." "Just thinking about your grandmother's words," I said. "She sounds like she knew what mattered." She did. She reached across the small space between us and squeezed my hand. "She would have liked you." The simple statement nearly undid me. Here was a woman who worked double shifts, lived paycheck to paycheck, and somehow had room in her heart for everyone she met. She was offering me her grandmother's hypothetical approval based on nothing more than my willingness to help with cabinet doors, and I was deceiving her with every breath. As I rode the bus home that night, I stared at my reflection in a dark window and wondered if it was possible to fall in love with someone while lying to them about everything you were. The question would haunt him more with each passing day.
2 months into the charade, Marcus had developed a strange double consciousness. By day, he was Marcus from the hardware store, whose biggest concern was whether Mrs. Chen, no relation, just cruel coincidence, would return the paint she'd bought 3 weeks ago. By night, he was still Marcus Chen, CEO, fielding urgent calls from his assistant and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but not as exhausting as the guilt. Sarah had become the center of his smaller, truer world. They fell into an easy rhythm. Dinners at her place, walks through Riverside Park, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market where she knew every vendor by name, and they all saved the best produce for that sweet nurse girl. She talked to him about her patients without breaking confidentiality, her dreams of maybe going back to school for her nurse practitioner degree, her worry about her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who was getting too frail to live alone. In return, Marcus found himself telling him things he'd never shared with anyone. Not about the money, never about the money, but about the loneliness of success, the weight of expectations, the strange emptiness of having everything you thought you wanted. "You're different from other guys I've dated," Sarah said one evening as they walked home from a movie they'd seen at the discount theater. She'd insisted on paying for her own ticket, and Marcus had let her, though the $5 expense probably cost her more than his usual entertainment budget of several thousand. "Different how?" Marcus asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Most guys, when they find out I'm a nurse, they either think I'm going to take care of them like their mother, or they assume I must be desperate because I'm still single at 28. She bumped his shoulder playfully. "You just see me, the real me." The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. She was praising him for seeing the real her while he showed her nothing but an elaborate fiction. "Sarah," he started, then stopped. "How do you confess to the woman you're falling in love with that everything she knows about you is a lie?" "What is it?" she asked, stopping under a streetlight that cast golden pools on the cracked sidewalk. Marcus looked into her face, trusting, open, beautiful in the way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the light that came from within. The words crowded in his throat. I'm not who you think I am. I'm rich, richer than you can imagine. I own 3 houses and haven't looked at a price tag in years. I've been lying to you about everything." "Nothing," he said instead. "Just thank you for seeing me too." But the guilt was becoming unbearable, a constant ache that no amount of rationalization could ease. What had started as a test of her character had become a betrayal of it. Sarah wasn't materialistic or shallow. She was the opposite of every woman who'd ever wanted him for his bank account. She was falling in love with him for exactly the reasons he'd hoped someone would, and he was repaying her honesty with deception. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Marcus was at Henderson's, helping a contractor figure out the right bolts for a deck project, when his phone rang. Not his pay-as-you-go phone that Sarah knew about, but his real phone, the one that connected him to his real life. "Marcus, we have a problem." His assistant's voice was tight with controlled panic. "The Singapore deal is falling apart. They want to talk to you directly, and they're in the office in 20 minutes. The Singapore deal. 3 months of negotiations, $40 million, hundreds of jobs. Marcus looked around the hardware store. George helping a customer choose the right screws, Mrs. Peterson browsing the gardening section, the familiar smell of sawdust and possibility. His other life felt like a distant planet. "I can't," he said. "Not today. Marcus, you don't understand. If this deal falls through—" "Handle it," Marcus said, and hung up. But the damage was done. The 2 worlds had collided, and the careful balance he'd maintained was crumbling. That evening, Sarah was late meeting him for dinner. When she finally arrived at their usual spot, a family-owned Italian place where the portions were generous and the prices weren't, her face was flushed with excitement. "You'll never guess what happened," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Mrs. Patterson from 3C, you know, the one with the diabetes, she was having problems affording her insulin. I mentioned it to one of the doctors I work with, and he connected her with this program that helps low-income patients get their medications." Sarah's eyes were bright with the joy of having helped someone, of having made a difference in the small, immediate way that actually mattered. She cried, Marcus, actually cried with relief. She's been rationing her insulin for 3 months, trying to make it stretch.
When was the last time you made a real difference in someone's life? Share how it felt in the comments. Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Here was Sarah, living paycheck to paycheck, taking on extra shifts to help her patients, finding ways to solve problems with compassion and creativity instead of money. And here was he, a man who could have solved Mrs. Patterson's problem with the loose change in his couch cushions, sitting across from her and pretending to struggle with the tip. "That's amazing," he said, meaning it completely. "You're amazing. We're all just doing what we can, right?" Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "I mean, you spend your free time helping me fix my cabinets. Mr. Henderson says you stay late to help customers, even when you're not getting paid overtime. We look out for each other." The weight of her trust, her assumption that he was fundamentally good, crushed down on him like a physical force. She loved him for being the kind of man who would sacrifice for others, and he was sacrificing nothing. He was playing dress-up in poverty, while his real wealth sat untouched, unused to help people like Mrs. Patterson, like Mrs. Kowalski, like Sarah herself, who worked herself to exhaustion because she couldn't afford not to. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion, what if someone you cared about had been lying to you? About something important?" She studied his face with the careful attention she probably gave to changes in her patient's conditions. "What kind of lying?" "The kind that changes everything." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I guess," she said slowly, "it would depend on why they were lying. Were they trying to hurt me, or were they trying to protect something?" "Protect," Marcus whispered. "Then I'd want to know the truth," Sarah said simply. Because lies don't actually protect anyone. They just delay the hurt and make it worse when it finally comes. Marcus looked into her honest, trusting face and knew that everything was about to change. The fairy tale was over. It was time to find out if love could survive the truth.
The next evening, Marcus stood in his penthouse for the first time in months, the city sprawling below him like a constellation of possibilities he'd forgotten he owned. His hand shook as he changed out of his work clothes, the costume that had become more real than the tailored suits hanging in his closet. He'd asked Sarah to meet him at Riverside Park, their usual place, but tonight would be different. Tonight, he would tell her everything. Sarah arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee from the bodega on the corner, the cheap kind that came in paper cups with plastic lids. She'd probably used a coupon. The thought made Marcus's chest ache with a tenderness so fierce it nearly knocked him over. "You sounded strange on the phone," she said, settling beside him on their favorite bench, the one with the view of the duck pond where they'd spent countless evenings talking about everything and nothing. "Is everything okay?" Marcus took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers, and wondered if this would be the last time she'd touch him willingly. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something that's going to change everything between us." Her face grew serious, the way it did when she was preparing for bad news. "Okay. My name is Marcus Chen. Marcus Chen of Chen Industries. I'm not poor, Sarah. I'm not struggling. I'm worth more money than you'll probably see in 10 lifetimes, and I've been lying to you about it since the day we met." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, hurt, and finally a careful blankness that Marcus recognized as her professional mask, the one she wore when she had to deliver devastating news to families. "I don't understand," she said quietly. So Marcus told her everything. The endless parade of women who saw dollar signs instead of a person, Vanessa's casual cruelty, the elaborate charade he'd constructed with the thrift store furniture and the job at Henderson's Hardware, his real apartment, his real life, his real fortune built on innovations that had changed how the world communicated. "The job at Henderson's?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "George thinks I'm just a guy who needed work. He doesn't know. The apartment in Riverside Heights? I rented it specifically for this. My real home is downtown, penthouse, 42nd floor." Sarah stood up abruptly, walking to the edge of the pond where the ducks had settled for the night. Marcus watched her shoulders rise and fall as she processed the magnitude of his deception. "So, when I was worried about affording groceries, you were, what, amused? Taking notes on how the poor people live?" "No," Marcus said urgently, standing and moving toward her. "Sarah, no. It was never like that." "Then what was it like, Marcus?" She spun to face him, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "What was it like watching me count coupons? What was it like when I apologized for my tiny apartment, or when I insisted on going Dutch at dinner because I couldn't afford to eat out more than once a week?" Each question hit him like a physical blow because they all contained the same underlying truth. While she'd been showing him her real, vulnerable, financially struggling self, he'd been performing an elaborate fiction. "It was like falling in love," Marcus said simply. "Sarah, everything I felt for you was real. Everything I told you about myself, my loneliness, my feelings, my thoughts, all of that was true. The only lie was the money." "The only lie?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marcus, money isn't just money. It's freedom. It's choices. It's the difference between staying up all night worried about a medical bill and sleeping peacefully because you know you're secure." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "When I told you about Mrs. Patterson rationing her insulin, you could have helped her. Right then. You could have fixed that problem with what you probably spend on lunch. The accuracy of her assessment cut deep because it was exactly what he'd been thinking. "You're right, I should have—" "But you didn't. Because helping her would have blown your cover, wouldn't it? Your little experiment in being poor was more important than actually helping people who are actually struggling? What would you do if someone you loved had been living a lie? How do you balance understanding their reasons with feeling betrayed? Tell us your thoughts." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him, the careful foundation of justification he'd built crumbling away. She was right. He'd been so focused on protecting his test that he'd ignored opportunities to use his resources for genuine good. "Sarah, please, let me explain why I—" "You know why," she said tiredly. "You wanted to find someone who would love you for you, not your money. And I get it, I do. But Marcus, what you don't understand is that by lying to me, you never gave me the chance to prove that I could love both. You never trusted me enough to find out if I was the kind of person who could see past your wealth to the man underneath." She was right again, and the truth of it was devastating.
"I was going to tell you," Marcus said desperately. "Tonight. That's why we're here. Sarah, I've been miserable keeping this from you. It's been eating me alive." "Then why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Weeks ago? Months ago? Why now?" Marcus looked into her eyes, those warm, honey-brown eyes that had seen him more clearly than anyone ever had, and gave her the only honest answer he had left. "Because I was scared. Because every other woman I've ever cared about chose the money over the man, and I couldn't bear the thought that you might too. Because loving you was the most real thing that had ever happened to me, and I didn't want to lose it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the pond where their ducks floated peacefully, unaware of the human drama playing out on the shore. "You want to know what's really heartbreaking?" she finally said. "It's not that you have money. It's not even that you lied about it. It's that you thought so little of me that you assumed I'd be like those other women. You thought I was capable of that kind of shallow gold digging, and you let me fall in love with you while believing that about my character." "That's not," Marcus started, but stopped because it wasn't entirely wrong. "I need time," Sarah said, turning back to him. "I need to think about who you really are and whether the man I fell in love with actually exists or if he was just another performance." She started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, Marcus, I did love you. The broke hardware store guy who helped customers after hours and fixed my cabinets and listened to me talk about my patients. I loved him completely. I just don't know if he was real." Marcus watched her disappear into the evening shadows, taking his heart with her. For the first time in months, he was completely alone with the truth of who he was and what he'd done. The next morning, Marcus walked into Henderson's Hardware and found George restocking the paint display. "George," he said, "I need to tell you something." An hour later, George Henderson sat behind his cluttered desk, staring at the check Marcus had just written. It was enough to modernize the store, expand the inventory, maybe even open a second location. "Son," George said slowly, "are you telling me you're some kind of millionaire?" "Multimillionaire, technically. And I want to keep working here if you'll have me. For real this time. No lies, no games. I'll take whatever salary you think is fair, and I want to help you grow this place." George looked at him for a long moment. "You know, I had a feeling there was more to your story. Nobody learns inventory systems that fast without some serious business experience." He leaned back in his chair. "The question is, why? Why work here when you could buy and sell this place without thinking twice?" Marcus thought about Sarah's words, about Mrs. Patterson and her insulin, about the difference between having money and using it wisely. Because this place matters. You matter. The customers matter. I've spent years building companies that exist mostly in computers and conference rooms. I want to do something real for a change." George nodded slowly. "All right, then. But we're doing this right. You want to invest in Henderson's? We'll do it properly. Legal contracts, fair terms. And Marcus? Yeah? That check better not bounce." For the first time in days, Marcus smiled. "I promise you, it won't." That afternoon, Marcus drove his rarely used pickup truck. He'd bought it on a whim 2 years ago and never driven it, to Mrs. Patterson's apartment building. He found her checking her mailbox, moving slowly, looking older than her 73 years. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Marcus, Sarah's friend." "Oh, you're the young man who's been helping Sarah with her apartment. She talks about you all the time." The past tense wasn't lost on him, but Marcus pressed on. "I heard about your situation with your medication. I have some connections in the pharmaceutical industry. Would it be okay if I looked into some options for you?" 3 phone calls later, Mrs. Patterson was enrolled in a program that would provide her insulin at no cost for the next 5 years. The pharmaceutical company, one Marcus had invested heavily in, was happy to help when he explained the situation. "I don't understand," Mrs. Patterson said, tears in her eyes. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." "Because someone I care about cares about you," Marcus said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus threw himself into what he privately called Operation Redemption. He established a fund to help Henderson's customers with emergency home repairs. He quietly paid off Mrs. Kowalski's medical bills and arranged for a visiting nurse. He started a scholarship program for nursing students at the community college. But he didn't contact Sarah. He'd promised her time, and he intended to keep that promise, even if it killed him.
She found him instead. Marcus was closing up the hardware store on a Friday evening, 2 weeks and 3 days after the worst conversation of his life, when he heard the familiar bell chime. He looked up to see Sarah silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the streetlights. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," Marcus replied, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. She looked tired, like she'd been working extra shifts, but there was something different in her eyes, a resolution that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Patterson told me about her insulin," she said, "and Mrs. Kowalski mentioned that her bills mysteriously got paid. And apparently there's a new scholarship program at the college that sounds suspiciously like something someone with a guilty conscience might start." Marcus set down the inventory clipboard he'd been pretending to read. "I should have done it sooner. You were right about that." "Yes, you should have," Sarah agreed. "But the fact that you're doing it now, that tells me something important." "What does it tell you?" Sarah moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "It tells me that the man I fell in love with, the one who stays late to help customers, who sees people who need help and finds ways to help them, that man is real. He just happens to have a lot more resources than I thought." Have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you with good intentions? How did you find your way back to trust? "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am so sorry. You deserved the truth from the beginning. You deserved the chance to choose me, all of me, with full knowledge of who I am." "You're right, I did," she said simply, "and I'm still hurt that you didn't trust me enough to give me that choice. But Marcus, I've spent the last 2 weeks thinking about this, and I realized something. You weren't the only one who was afraid." "What do you mean?" Sarah took another step closer. "I was terrified of falling for someone who might leave when things got difficult, someone who might decide that my crazy schedule and my tiny apartment and my secondhand furniture weren't good enough. So when I met you, this sweet, funny, kind man who seemed perfectly content with my simple life, I fell hard. Maybe I needed to believe you were struggling too, so I wouldn't have to worry about you outgrowing me." Marcus reached out tentatively, and when she didn't pull away, he took her hands in his. "You think I could outgrow you? Sarah, you're the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met. You make me want to be better than I've ever been. Even now that you know I'm not some saint who's immune to money worries and petty concerns about whether I'm good enough?" "Especially now," Marcus said firmly. "Sarah, I don't want perfect. I want real. I want you, cranky in the morning, stressed about bills, passionate about your patients, suspicious of self-checkout machines. I want all of it." Sarah searched his face, and Marcus held his breath, waiting for her verdict. "Okay, but we're doing this differently this time. No more lies, no more tests, no more pretending to be something you're not to see if I'm something I'm not. Just truth, even when it's scary." "Especially when it's scary," Marcus agreed. "And Marcus, I have some conditions." "Anything." "First, I keep my apartment. I know you probably have some palace somewhere, but that tiny studio is mine. I earned it, I love it, and I'm not giving it up to be some kept woman in a penthouse." Marcus smiled. "Done, though. I should mention the palace is actually just a really big apartment with too much marble and a view that gets lonely. Second, I pay my own way. I know you want to swoop in and solve all my problems, but my independence matters to me. We figure out how to make this work as equals, even if our bank accounts aren't equal." "That might be challenging," Marcus said carefully. "Which brings me to condition 3. You use that money for good. Real good. Not charity galas where rich people pat themselves on the back, but actual help for actual people. You want to be worthy of love? Be worthy of the resources you've been given." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen for the first time in months. This was Sarah seeing all of him, the wealth, the fear, the potential for both harm and good, and choosing to love him anyway, with conditions that would make him better. "I can work with those terms," Marcus said. "Good," Sarah said, and then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Because I missed you. I missed us. Even if us turns out to be more complicated than I thought." Marcus pulled her closer until he could rest his forehead against hers. "I missed you too, more than I've ever missed anything." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we figure it out together. The real us. No lies, no games, no pretending to be something you're not to see if I'm something I'm not. Just truth, even when it's scary." "Especially when it's scary," Marcus agreed. And then he kissed her, there in the hardware store, surrounded by the honest smell of sawdust and possibility, and it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been, but had always been searching for.
6 months later, Marcus stood in the same hardware store, but everything had changed. Henderson's Hardware had expanded into the empty storefront next door, and they now employed 12 people from the neighborhood. The scholarship program had sent its first class of nursing students to school. Mrs. Patterson's insulin program had been expanded citywide, and Sarah's engagement ring, which she'd insisted on picking out herself from a local jeweler, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money, caught the light as she helped a customer choose the right screws for a bookshelf. She'd kept her apartment, though they'd gotten permission to knock through to the unit next door, creating a space that was still modest but no longer cramped. Marcus had kept his penthouse too, but they found they preferred the smaller space, with its view of the alley cats and the sound of real life happening all around them. "You know what I love most about this?" Sarah said that evening as they walked home from the store, their hands intertwined, her engagement ring a simple promise between them. "What's that?" "We're building something real," she said. "Not just between us, but in the world. We're making it better, one insulin prescription and one job and one scholarship at a time." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Think your grandmother would approve?" "She'd say you're finally doing something worthy with what you've been given," Sarah replied, "and she'd probably ask when you're going to make an honest woman out of me." "Well," Marcus said, stopping under the streetlight where he'd first told her the truth, "how about we start planning that wedding?"
Sarah's smile was brighter than all the city lights combined. "I thought you'd never ask." And as they stood there planning their future, a small ceremony, maybe in Riverside Park, definitely with Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Kowalski and George Henderson in attendance, Marcus realized he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all along. Not someone who would love him despite his wealth or because of it, but someone who would love him enough to help him use it wisely. Someone who saw all of him and chose to build something beautiful together. It turned out the best things in life weren't free. They cost everything you had, but they gave back more than you could ever imagine. Love, it seemed, was the best investment he'd ever made. The end. What did you think of Marcus and Sarah's journey? Have you ever had to choose between security and authenticity in love? Share your thoughts and let us know what part of their story resonated most with you.